and welcome to the election show on the Manhattan Neighborhood Network. I am your host, Dr. Christina Greer, Associate Professor of Political Science at Fordham University and the co-host of the podcast FAQ NYC. Joining me today via Zoom, as always, is Matt McDermott, the Communications Strategist and Vice President of the Whitman Insight Strategies. And also with me is political analyst and professor of political science at Columbia University, Lincoln Mitchell. Hello, gentlemen. How are you?
Good to be with you.
So, never a dull moment in the American democracy and the big experiment that may be coming to a close. But before it does, hopefully we can analyze a few things. Matt, I'll start with you. It seems like the president has painted himself into a pretty interesting corner. So we've seen the uprisings across all 50 states, to say nothing of all of the countries across the globe. But protests and, in some places, really, I would say, violent interactions between the police state and citizens of the United States. And the president has had some peculiar responses, especially via Twitter. And he's, implored governors to call out the National Guard and to use pretty excessive force on American residents and citizens. And even has employed a secret police in Washington, D.C. to sort of keep the peace, how he loosely defines it. What do you think about the president in this moment where it seems like, in the backdrop of COVID, 40 million plus Americans unemployed, he still has his loyal base, but do you feel like he's slipping? And do you think he thinks he's slipping?
It's safe to say Donald Trump is at arguably the weakest point of his presidency at the moment. There's been a number of different polls that have been released over the last few days showing his approval rating has fallen now below 40%. And really what's driving that is a negative reaction, a counter effect to his own reaction to these peaceful protests over the last few weeks. I think in all of the metrics we've seen, his decision, as insane as it is, to use tear gas against peaceful protesters will go down as one of the most insane things of his presidency. And you're seeing the effect of it in his poll numbers. Part of his challenge is simple. He's using a law and order message that's worked effectively for Republicans for decades, and it's not working for him. And you go back, as far back as Reagan running for governor in '66, Nixon running for president in '68, every major Republican Party nominee or person in the White House has used a law and order message that Democrats are soft on crime, and so we need Republicans to step in and pursue some sort of law and order and keep America safe. The problem for Donald Trump is it's not working. And in part, it's not working because voters see Donald Trump for who he is. He's a liar. He has not kept America safe. And so in polling that's been done over the last week, for the first time in really modern history, the Democratic nominee in Joe Biden is beating the Republican on the issue of law and order, is beating the Republican on the issue of who can best keep America safe, because they know at this point who Donald Trump is. He's a fraud. He's a liar. He has not kept this country safe. And in fact, his words and his rhetoric have forced violence on the American people in a way that we haven't seen in our lifetimes. And so it's a really strange dynamic in that Donald Trump is at an especially low point of his presidency, and it's hard to see how he comes out of this hole, given the fact that the only message that's potentially effective for him, this law and order message, is not resonating in the same way it would if any other Republican was in the White House.
Lincoln, do you agree?
About most of that. The one thing I would point out is that the law and order message tends to work for Republicans when they're not incumbents, right? So Reagan running against Pat Brown in California in '66, pointing at the unrest on the campuses, was really a focal point of that campaign. But he was the challenger saying, I can restore law and order. Mm-hmm. Similarly, Richard Nixon in 1968. The example that may be most relevant here is George H.W. Bush in 1992, following the uprisings in numerous American cities around the Rodney King verdict, where he could not present himself as an agent of law and order, and the challenger, Bill Clinton, ended up winning that election. Where I do very much agree with Matt is, and maybe I would take it a step further, I think Trump, the numbers are terrible right now for Trump. But moreover, in a very meaningful way, he has lost his legitimacy. When he threatened to use the military, and a number of retired generals, including General Mattis, spoke out against that. But more importantly, Mark Esper, who was a Trump appointee And to use, not to put it too delicately, but as a defense contractor hack, right, who somehow landed in this job, he came out and said he couldn't do it. And he said he couldn't do it because the general said, we're not going to do it. And when you are a president who doesn't have democratic legitimacy, and I think most people would recognize that about Donald Trump, if you can't control the security forces, your hold on power is very tenuous. And that's where Donald Trump is now. The only thing that's keeping in power in now, I think, is among American society, the traditional rule of law, and that we solve things at elections through legal processes. This looks like a country right now. We have thousands of people on the streets of many, many American cities and all American states, as you pointed out. We have support coming from all kinds of places. You know, we have major institutions, cultural institutions, business institutions saying Black Lives Matter, and we don't support the president on this, right? We have neighbors. I mean, when you go to a demonstration in New York, you have neighbors in all different neighborhoods leaning out the windows and clapping, people coming out of churches, synagogues, small businesses. You have the president barricading himself at times in a bunker and other times in a fence around the White House, right, which is now been plastered with opposition slogans, right? And we have a president who's lost control of the security forces. Not lost control, but has threatened to play a card he doesn't have. This looks like regime collapse. Trump, in 1968, Dick Daley, the mayor of Chicago, said famously, the police aren't here to create disorder, they're here to preserve disorder. Trump is here both to create and preserve disorder. The one thing that I think may be able to turn this around a little bit is if the economic news in late summer is very good. And there are some people on the economic side who say that, but right now, we're looking at, by August 1st, 150,000 or more COVID deaths. And regardless of who you blame for that, and that might be a partisan issue for some, because some will blame the demonstrators, but regardless of who you blame, that precludes a full economic recovery. So I think he's in a very tough spot, and he will end up using non-democratic approaches to try to stay in power.
Well, I think I want to go on that train of thought, because, you know, when you listen to people who and read about regime changes and regime collapses, the final death knell is stealing elections, and we know that November 3rd is around the corner. We've seen the president literally call out to Russia and China asking for their assistance in possible interference in any capacity. We know that the president's deathly afraid of becoming just a regular citizen again, because he's afraid that he'll have to meet some of the attorney generals from the states of Florida and New York, and possibly whatever punishment he might face in DC. And so knowing all of that, knowing that our election processes are getting less and less secure by the day, it seems like the president doesn't ever seem to lose his base, though. They are with him to the end. And that's a little over 30% of Americans, no matter what he does, what he says, they can find a way to justify it. Matt, I want to go back to you. Why can't the Democrats seem to capitalize this moment? And why are we having these really hard debates trying to convince middle of the road Republicans, middle of the road Democrats, that this president has reached the end of the road? He has put our democracy in a beyond precarious position. We're on the precipice of losing it all. Why has it been so difficult for the Democrats to sort of take this message? And as Lincoln said, over 110,000 deaths now, we could be looking at another 150,000 in just the next few months. Over 40 million people have filed for unemployment, and we know that there's so many millions more who aren't even in sectors who can file. So the economic turmoil is severe. Why can't the Democrats seem to just clinch this in a succinct message and say, there is no question, let's just wait until November 3rd, because that's when the election is, but let's move forward. Let's start planning different policies. But Donald Trump is done.
And it goes back to your point, right? Is Donald Trump will always have a base of 35, 38, 39%. That will always exist. There will always be a cohort of voters that believe in that message of racial resentment. Obviously, there are a lot of other messages in there as well, but that's essentially what it is. It's a message of racial resentment. I'm a bit more optimistic in terms of where Democrats are than I think your question suggests, if only because there's sort of two things at play right now. To Lincoln's point, I think we've seen over the last few days a number of different officials from the military or used to be in the military essentially come out and say, this is a threat to our democracy if we elect Donald Trump. That is a huge shift from what we've seen over the last 3 weeks. And if that continues, it suggests to that middle of the road voter that the very institutions that are meant to protect the safety of this country think that our current president is a threat to those institutions. That, I think, is one element. The other element is, as we get closer to the election, you're starting to see the down ballot effect of Donald Trump. And you're starting to see Senate races that, frankly, should never be in play for Democrats now suddenly in play. I think we always looked at a Senate map of states like Arizona, of Colorado, of Maine, maybe of North Carolina. But you're seeing over the last few days now polling coming out of places like Montana, out of Kansas, out of Georgia, out of
South Carolina.
Correct, South Carolina, showing Senate races that should not be competitive for Democrats. And so there's a real down ballot threat for Republicans maintaining this relationship with Donald Trump, and it very well could lose them hold of the Senate. And so I think as we get closer to the election, if those two things continue to happen, you're going to see a number of Republicans who have sort of come out on the ledge and said some things, Mitt Romney being the obvious example. There was a piece in the New York Times this week about sort of the role of George W. Bush in this election. I'll leave that for other people to punticize on. But if you have current Republican senators like a Mitt Romney coming out and saying, you know what, we can't do this anymore. I voted for impeachment. This guy can't get another term and there's only one alternative. That, I think, moves the needle in a way that we didn't see in 2016 and that we haven't, frankly, seen to this date.
When you mentioned Colin Powell and Mattis and sort of some of these very well-respected individuals in the military who have served our nation, does your polling suggest that middle-of-the-road Republicans and Democrats care what they say?
And so the job for Biden in this whole election, and we've talked about this, is one, how do you shore up and maintain your base of support? And actually in polling that's out this week, Joe Biden has 92, 93, 94% of the vote of Democrats. He's shoring up the Democratic base in the last month in a better, stronger way than Donald Trump has in years. But really what he needs to focus on, and where you've seen the biggest shift in the electorate since 2016, is among white women, frankly, white women in the suburbs, who turned against Republicans in 2018 in record numbers, which is why you saw Democrats win House districts in places like Oklahoma, in places like Kansas and upstate Minnesota and Michigan. And you're seeing that same trend persist into 2020. White women who voted for Donald Trump in 2016 by a few point margin. In fact, a lot argued after that election, white women were the cohort of voters that gave Donald Trump the presidency, are now supporting Joe Biden by a 15-point margin. And that's not a number that's insignificant. To see that shift among a cohort of voters in this short a period of time suggests that something seismic has happened in this electorate. And I think the question after 2018 was always, will we see that same seismic shift continue on through 2020? And thus far we have. And things like, tear gassing peaceful protesters, things like using the military against its own citizens, those are things that are at the antithesis of what white women are looking for in terms of a president they can support. And so unless they change their route, unless they figure out how to persuade these women that they've lost and other voters, they're in a very precarious position for re-election, and it has effects for down ballot Republicans as well.
So Lincoln, in our previous conversations over the past few weeks, you've been really clear about some of the challenges to even have that equity. And so when we think about what we saw the other day in Georgia and the lines of thousands of Americans who were trying to vote and couldn't, and they voted at 12:37 at night, and they stood in line for 3 to 4 hours. What's your feeling about if Matt is indeed correct? And we know that Democrats are sort of gaining on the president, not just at the presidential level, but also down ballot. What do we know about the voter disenfranchisement efforts of the Republican Party, Donald Trump explicitly, on a statewide level that would prevent the scenario that Matt just laid out?
I would kind of combine your previous two questions, because this notion that the Democrats aren't doing enough, I think Matt laid out a very good case that they are doing enough. Right now, with a candidate who may be uniquely positioned because his temperament is essentially conservative, although his politics aren't, the Democrats are drubbing the Republicans. When states like Kentucky and Kansas and South Carolina are in play on the Senate side, when you have in some polls a double-digit lead, when the president's approval is consistently under 45% and in many cases under 40%, the Democrats are doing just fine on the political side. And we need to kind of recognize that, because when we repeat this, tell this story that the Democrats aren't doing enough, they always lose, Trump's going to win, we give fodder to a very dangerous story that Trump is going to push after the election. And I want to now get back to your question you asked me, which is, to me, the absolutely central question. What I would say that every thinking and concerned American citizen has to wake up every morning and say to themselves, if they want to understand what's going on more easily and less stressfully, is that we no longer live in a democracy. So let's look at Georgia, the state of Georgia, where there was a primary yesterday, where there were terrible problems with people not being able to vote, with enormous lines, problems that will repeat themselves with, I hate to say this, a more racist side in the general election. You'll see more of those problems in African-American communities and white communities. And the reason is that Brian Kemp is governor, right? And he is doing this. But why is Brian Kemp governor? Because he won a fraudulent election. In plain English, he stole that election from Stacey Abrams. That is a real blow to our democracy. And when you repeat it in varying degrees, not just over 30 numerous states, but over decades, you really have a point where we no longer live in a democracy. Partisan elected officials are administering elections in ways to help their political party. And that is a violation of generally accepted norms of democracy. Not everyone's vote matters equally, right? That is also a violation of these norms. We have to recognize that we are in a fight for democracy. And that means not only that the fight against voter suppression needs to be front and center, which it does, right? And that needs to be as resourced as, getting campaign plotters out of something like that. But we also need to be raising awareness. This has to be part of the message, right? People need to know, because if Trump wins, it is very likely that he won because of election fraud. And if he loses, he will claim he lost because of election fraud. And we need to be prepared not just to win on November 3rd, but for a strategy beginning on November 4th, when Trump tells his people, Antifa people were stealing ballot boxes in rural Pennsylvania, and undocumented Mexican workers, and he'll use more nasty language than that, were voting illegally in parts of the Southwest and the Midwest where there are swing states. And African Americans from state A were bussed over to vote in state B. And he will say that, and the leadership in the Senate, many of whom are now concerned about whether they will remain at liberty after this election because of their complicity in a lot of this stuff, will support him. The propaganda wing, which is, say, Fox News, will support him. And most importantly, he showed us a month ago that his base, that 30% that just stays with him, the cult, they will take up arms to support him. And that is where I fear America is heading. And I know there are some out there who say, don't worry, the Capitol Police this, the military that. Well, it's not that simple. The Capitol Police, who are they listening to? The military, who do they listen to, right? Once you get to the Electoral College voting in mid-December, if the Electoral College votes for Biden, Trump is done. But getting even from a win on November 3rd to there is not going to be easy. And as much as we need lawyers to help do this, we also need an ongoing strategy of demonstrations of the kind we've seen the last weeks, except bigger and with a possible threat of violence greater, because Trump has more directly at stake, and in the context of a return of COVID. And these are daunting tasks, daunting challenges, but they're more daunting when we ignore them and say, don't worry, the Capitol Police or the Supreme Court will take care of it. Maybe it's just me, but I don't think the Supreme Court with Brett Kavanaugh is going to do anything to take care of getting Donald Trump out of office when he loses an election.
No, not at all. I mean, if we remember in 2000, the Supreme Court sided with George Bush in the vote, and then in the opinion said, by the way, never use this precedent again. So we've seen the Supreme Court fail at their jobs. Matt, you wanted to say something?
Let me add to what Lincoln said, because I want to be clear to folks that are listening. The issue with our elections this year is beyond just suppression of the vote that Republicans have done for decades. The biggest issue we face in our election this year is tens of millions of voters will be voting in a format that they're not used to. And you're seeing that play out in places across the country wherein, given the crisis we're in right now, a lot of voters don't want to go to the polls, right? You don't want to go stand in line at a precinct when you're in the middle of a global pandemic. So the alternative is mail-in voting. And a number of states, particularly those with Democratic Secretary of States and Democratic leadership, have implemented mail-in voting. The problem with that is it's a new form of voting for a lot of voters. And so take New York City, for instance, in a typical election, maybe 5% of voters participate via mail-in ballot. In the upcoming primaries, it's looking like 60, maybe 70% of voters in New York City are going to vote by mail-in ballot in the upcoming primaries later in June. That's a seismic shift in just functionally how people are voting. There's a lot of processes that have to happen to make that as accessible and easy as possible. You're seeing a lot of issues and a lot of problems pop up in New York City, as an example, because just nobody was prepared for the number of people that are preparing to vote by mail-in ballot. And so what Democrats need to be doing, particularly in states that they control the electoral system, in places like Arizona, in places like North Carolina, in places like Colorado, all of which have Democratic secretaries of state, there needs to be more done to ensure that come November, when people don't want to go to the polls to vote, there's ways for them to do it in a fair and accessible way that they may not be used to. It's going to take a lot of work on everyone's part, and Democrats, frankly, need to start implementing strategies now to deal with that, because it's a very different problem than we faced in previous elections, notwithstanding the suppression efforts that are still taking place nationwide.
So, I mean, I think, Matt, you know, my frustration is that we know this. We've been under a global pandemic for 2 months plus now. And I think that the Democrats are so terrible at offense and not that strong on defense either. And so if we know that we're asking people to vote in a format they're not familiar with, we know that the voting rolls will be challenged and there'll be lots of confusion as to who is registered and who isn't. Why isn't there more of a coordinated effort amongst the Democratic Party to get a succinct message out to the leadership on the statewide level, local Democratic leaders, because we know lots of mayors across cities are Democratic mayors, who can disseminate that information quickly and succinctly to the populace to help them understand this moment?
And that, to me, is the biggest misstep of the Democratic Party at the moment, is looking at every number, every data point that exists out there. If an election was held today, I assume if the election is held in November, Democrats are going to win the presidency and frankly pick up a lot of seats down ballot. The single thing that gets in the way of that happening is people not being able to vote. And so the Democratic Party, to your point exactly, I think needs to start doing more to, one, put the systems in place to make voting as easy and accessible as it should be. Two, ensure that voters understand the options they have when it comes to voting. And three, we also need to start communicating to voters that unless something changes, this election will not be decided on election night. There's just no way any board of election in this country can count the tens of millions of mail-in ballots that are going to take place in this election in a fast and efficient way. It's not possible. There's no system that allows it to happen. And so for better or worse, we're not going to know the winner of the election come election night. That's going to scare a lot of people. It hasn't happened in our previous presidential elections. And we need to make voters aware of the fact that at 12:01 a.m., when Donald Trump takes to Twitter and says he won the election, that's probably not accurate. And if we don't start communicating just the functional realities of our new normal, that will be a problem that we face heading up to the election, but frankly, on election night itself.
Right. Lincoln, what are your thoughts?
Well, I think one of the challenges is that a lot of states haven't figured out exactly what they're doing. So while they definitely need to communicate this, and at the time, and you're going to have to put a lot of money and effort into communicating it, right now, they're not sure what it is they're communicating. This point about not knowing on election night, this is super important, because that is when what Donald Trump will be saying is I won at 12:01 a.m. But then he on that Wednesday, but then he will be saying they're delaying it because now is when the cheating is. Now is when the election is being stolen. And then I see us in my fear here is that the scenario is then you see, imagine, the Brooks Brothers riot of 2000, but with more interesting attire and more heavy artillery at hundreds of places where the votes are being counted around the country. And that's a real scenario. And that is, I know that sounds dramatic, but explain to me why that won't happen, right? This is a man who's desperate to stay in office, who will tell anything, and who has a cult-like following from a large but minority of the population. So that's where this gets very frightening to me. I think the point about working through the logistics of the mail, this is extremely important, and Matt gets it 100% right. There's a lot of difficulties here, a lot of challenges. It's going to be different state by state. So you call your your mom in California for help doing this because you're going to school in Ohio and she tells you something that's not how you do it there. So this is going to be very difficult, but it's as important as putting up the GOTV posters or running that clever new ad.
So before I let you all leave, we'll talk again in 2 weeks. God willing, the democracy still stands. What do you think the Democrats should be doing in the next 2 weeks? We still have uprisings across the country. We have questions of Democratic leadership and how they've been complicit with police departments and police unions. What's the messaging that not only Joe Biden needs to carry forth, but Democratic leaders across the country in the next few days/weeks? Matt, I'll start with you.
Our most effective message is being communicated by the president every day, which is, who the hell in their right mind wants to sit through another 4 years of this? Let Donald Trump take that message to voters. It's very clear. I think for Democrats, we need to start laying out what the alternative looks like. But I think both Joe Biden and the party can start putting forth what their agenda would look like given the crises that we face. Obviously, after this election, significant work is going to need to be done, both in the public health space and the economic front. And I think it's unclear to most voters at the moment what that agenda looks like. Democrats need to be prepared to hit the ground running on day one if November turns out the way that polls would suggest. And I don't necessarily at the moment see that being put forth. So I think both Biden and Democrats in Congress need to start figuring out what future stimulus packages look like and recognize that even though Donald Trump is taking to Twitter every day talking about record stock market gains, 30 million people are out of work right now. And there's no plan in place to get those people back to work so long as we have an economy that's debilitated by a public health crisis that we face.
We've already seen Democrats in the House, the Congressional Black Caucus, along with the Speaker, working on passing legislation through the House, getting it to the Senate. If the Democrats take back the Senate, they need to push that through in early January and have that and more legislation of the kind Matt is describing on President Biden's desk, ready to be signed the 21st. At the state and local level right now, mayors and governors who are Democrats should be doing two primary things. First, they should be urging demonstrators to be peaceful in plain English, be as peaceful as possible. And second, they should urge them to wear masks, practice social distancing when possible. And I guess part 2A, unlike which the NYPD do not do, the police should have to wear masks. I was talked upon deliberately by a police officer when I asked him why he wasn't wearing a mask. Police officers in every city need to wear masks or they should be fined or fired or something like that. And every mayor should make it clear because it shows they're on the side of law and order.
Yeah, I think that that's a really key point because when we've been watching a lot of these protests, what has been really astonishing to me are the number of police officers who are in the faces of protesters, spraying pepper spray, sometimes taking masks off of protesters and spraying pepper spray, and they themselves don't have masks on. So this is, we know that part of the public health crisis that we're going to see is because of early reopening and reopening too early, but some of it will be because of this transference of the coronavirus from people who refuse to wear masks to others who are trying to do their best to stay safe. Thank you both so much for being here with me. I'm Dr. Christina Greer. You've been watching the election show on MNN. Thank you all so much for joining me. Stay safe and wear a mask.